Okay. All right. Well, so Arjun Maheshwari, okay, is a rising junior at Stanford University. Can you hit the space bar once? There we go. And one more time. There we go. There you are. Originally from Minnesota and is studying symbolic systems and political science. When not poring over obscure maps in the depths of Green Library, you can find Arjun coaching debate at Palo Alto High School, doing political science research, cross-country skiing, or playing the drums. Arjun is pursuing internships in biotech and venture capital and eventually hopes to go to law school. And I'm going to let Liv now introduce the context of Arjun's talk.
Hi, I'm Christina Larson. I'm the assistant rare map librarian here. And the California Map Society used to sponsor an essay competition in conjunction with the Rumsey Center. But a couple of years ago, decision was made to change that to a student exhibition curatorial competition. So we invented sort of the process for doing that and had our first round of submissions last year, and Arjun was the winner. So the exhibition that you see up here today is the work that he's going to be talking about right now. And I just want to say it was a delight to work with him. He was a wonderful curator and collaborator, and I'm really proud of the work that he's done with us. And thank you all for your support of this ongoing project. We have a 5-year program to do this exhibition competition. We've just got our first round of entries for the next year's competition, and we'll be selecting finalists, I believe, at the end of November. So stay tuned for that. All right, thanks, and I'll turn it over to Arjun.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and being such strong supporters and patrons of the California Map Society, the David Rumsey Map Center, and the practice of cartography. And a special thanks to Christina and all the rest of the DRMC staff. I really could not have done it without your expertise, constant feedback, and patience for my naivete. Also, it's such an honor to be able to speak in front of you all today and alongside such an esteemed panel of guests. All right, with that, my name is Arjun Maheshwari. I'm a rising junior at Stanford University studying symbolic systems and history. And like I presume is the case for 99% of this room, I'm an avid map nerd. From the moment that I can remember, I've been poring over atlases, globes, whatever I could really get my hands on, honestly. In middle school, I did a bunch of geography Bs and geography Olympiads, and in high school, I got really into like international politics and stuff like that. My college essay is literally a love letter to my childhood atlas. So, all right. So naturally, when I went to college, I started, looking into ways that I could explore cartography a little bit more. And I eventually stumbled upon, in a really dark corner of the Brenner Earth Sciences Library, a stash of old free maps. Yeah, shout out. And I started adding a few to my collection, and I eventually found this really tiny one, literally like a 7x11 piece of paper. It was torn up, and it ended up being this super fabulous map of the foreign concessions to Tientsin, which is modern day Tianjin in China. Essentially, this map showcases the aftermath of the Opium Wars, when the Qing dynasty was forced to give a lot of concessions to European and other imperial powers because they had lost so much territory and land. And I was really fascinated by this map because, as you can see, there are literally 11 different jurisdictions controlling one small city. This shows the height of the foreign concessions in China and became the inspiration for the collection that we see here today. So then, yeah, naturally, a few months later, when I came across the collection, my mind immediately darted to this map to take inspiration. I decided that I was going to explore the idea of scarcity of space, understanding how groups interact with each other in small cities and small areas of land. And eventually, through extensive consultation with the staff, I created a really comprehensive narrative that explored this intense, fundamental, and timeless geopolitical problem: how groups respond to scarcity of space and limitations on natural resources. Eventually, we split it up into 5 major sub-themes, and these sub-themes roughly track against 5 major themes that I saw in terms of reactions for how groups respond to scarcity of space. So what are those? Well, in the most optimal scenario, we can see groups getting along. It's quite rare, but it can happen that groups eventually find peaceful agreements to longstanding geopolitical conflicts, and that's where we get heterogeneous harmony. However, humans being humans eventually end up fighting over land, and there's a multitude of scenarios that can arise from that. The first major one that we could see from that is when groups essentially have to sort of live with each other, but they don't really like it very much, which is where we get conflict-induced coexistence. But in the alternative scenario, one group essentially commandeers the entire territory of another, which is where we get foreign incursions. However, sometimes foreign incursions are pretty short lasting in the sense of, there could be tussling for land or territory that can create really chaotic political environments that essentially result in really short-lived political arrangements, which we captured in A Snapshot in Time. And because of all of these four major ways in which groups can try to divide or share land, we see a lot of differing interpretations that come arise because of that, differing perspectives on the exact same piece of geographical space where we get differing interpretations. So ultimately, through the creation of this exhibition, initially the way I looked at it was viewing it in terms of individual maps. But then as I started realizing, I started seeing that these maps really were a more universal concept. They span time, geography, ethnicity, race, all these factors. And it made me start to think really about how these maps show a narrative about things that are really fundamental to human existence. The reason why we have scarcity of space and responses to scarcity of space is not by accident. It's because humans are inherently explorers. We're inherently passionate and bold, and we are inherently a little bit obstinate. So ultimately, that's why I think it's so important that we discuss this topic today, because scarcity of space has been undoubtedly a historical thing, and that's what this exhibition covers, is the historical piece of it. However, our posterity is increasingly going to have to do with scarcity of space. We have rising sea levels, urban agglomeration, resource scarcity, all these problems that are going to increasingly put people into more confined areas of land. And that's why it's ever so important that we talk about how groups have historically responded to scarcity of space. So with that, I'm going to go into the first sub-theme, which is heterogeneous harmony. And I've chosen the map that is actually way in the back over there. And it's this ethnographic survey that was conducted by the Hungarian Political Science Institute in the 1930s, which was essentially the first survey of its kind that tracked ethnic groups in Hungary, or rather the former Kingdom of Hungary prior to the Trianon Treaty. And this map essentially shows all the different ethnic groups that were listed in Hungary at the time. It kind of paints this picture of how these groups kind of lived together and were kind of forced under the same jurisdiction. And at the time, they did have relatively harmonious agreements. However, one thing that's really interesting about this map is that they include Jews as a separate ethnic category, which, of course, considering that this is the 1930s, is a very timely thing in Central Europe. Now, Jews are listed as only 1% of Hungary's population in this map, but in reality, Jews were a far greater percentage. The reason for that being that Hungarian Jews in this map were not counted as Jews, they were counted as Hungarians, which ultimately had major impacts in terms of how, when Hungary joined the Axis powers, the effects on anti-Semitic policies in the Holocaust. And the fact that that Jews were listed as Hungarians was reflected in all of these cities. You see Budapest, Szeged, Debrecen. You don't see any Jewish representation, even though Jewish people were undoubtedly there. Now, this is a really important development because while at the time this seems like a rosy picture of heterogeneous harmony, just within 2 years of this map's publishing, Jews started to be increasingly ostracized by the Hungarian government as they started to be more malleable to German complaints about anti-Semitic policy. And they eventually became, obviously, tragic victims of the Holocaust. Another interesting development of this map is that while it initially was heterogeneous, you do start seeing these lines being formed that roughly track to where we see modern day borders between Hungary and Slovakia, for instance, or Hungary and Croatia, for instance. So again, this map, while it is an example of heterogeneous harmony, it kind of forecasts a lot of the conflicts that we'll see in the future in terms of nationalism and ethnic separation that defined Central Europe in the latter half of the 20th century. Right, yeah, sorry. Red is Hungarian, green is Slovak, and blue is Croatian. And that's a good segue into conflict-induced coexistence. For this category, I've chosen this map of Calcutta, which was published in 1912 by essentially the British Raj. And this map is super interesting because of the geopolitical situation that it arose in. In 1905, just 6 years prior, the British had divided the largest province of the British Raj, Bengal, into a primarily Eastern Muslim Bengal and a Western Hindu Bengal. But at the time, there was a growing nationalist revolutionary sentiment, and Hindus and Muslims were united against the idea of being divided and ruled. And so there was intense social pressure, which caused the British to actually departition Bengal in 1911, just 1 year prior to this map's publishing. As a result of the departitioning, there was an increase in flurry of revolutionary activity and perceived quote unquote risk and terroristic activity to the British installments in Calcutta. And this is where we get this map. This map is essentially a comprehensive survey of every single thing that could possibly be relevant to British military, civilian, political, or economic interests in Calcutta without, considering any of the actual Indian people that lived there. So in that sense, this map is a really good example of conflict-induced coexistence on the political axis of Indian and British tension that was rising at this time. But it's also notably a good example of the economic axis of conflict-induced coexistence. The British Raj notoriously was famous for, as with all the other colonial powers, for being excessively mercantilist. And this map is no different. We see all of these ghats along the Hooghly River. Ghat is a word for shipping dock. And we see all these various either trades or areas which exports are meant to go to. So for example, we see Salt Gula Ghat, which is meant for salt exports. We see Armenian Ghat for exports and imports from Armenia. And this is evidence of the increasing tension between Indians and British on economic lines, because of all the manufacturing and industry that the British commandeered from the Indians, it resulted in significant economic disparities and even resulted in a famine that killed more people than Mao and Stalin combined. Ultimately, while this map is a good example of conflict-induced coexistence on both political and economic lines, it's the most quintessential example of foreign incursions, which is the next topic. So at first value, this map at face value, this map is not necessarily the most obvious map to choose for foreign incursions, but I'd point you to the date here, 1941. This is of Leningrad, and during 1941, just 3 months prior to this map's publishing in September, there was the German siege of Leningrad that had started that lasted nearly 3 years. So what this map is a response to that. This is a Soviet Red Army map that's confidential. It says confidential in Russian in the top right corner. And it is essentially similar to the previous map that we looked at, a comprehensive list of all of the military installments in the Leningrad region. So this map is super interesting for a multitude of reasons, one of which being the incredible level of detail. So this was listed in a Soviet military atlas, and a few decades after it was published, it was marveled at by European and Eastern cartographers just for the amount of detail that it had. But the fact that there is so much detail is evidence of how Leningrad was such a heavily militarized city, which again gives leeway to the idea that after all the wars ended, their entire economy was essentially centered around this military idea, which then caused the economic problems that we know to exist in the Soviet Union. The fourth category we have is Snapshot and Time. The map I've chosen here is a tourist map of Johannesburg that was published in 1951 during the apartheid regime. The reason why this map is interesting is primarily because of the audience it's geared towards. This is pretty much just a generic map of Johannesburg, but it's meant for European tourists to try to lure them to come visit Johannesburg. In this map, in the outline, we see all of these things that are meant to, kind of portray Johannesburg as this sophisticated, quote unquote, civilized, European-esque city. We see academic institutions like the Witwatersrand University, Monroe Drive, the gold mines to kind of show economic prosperity, Pioneer Park, golf courses. We see all these sorts of lavish displays of wealth in order to try to convince people that, this is a place that's worth visiting. But also we see, curiously enough, an allusion to sort of lost world narratives that were popular in Europe at the time, trying to get people to harken back to the idea of adventure and mysticism and exoticism. You should come to South Africa because there's safari, all these sorts of things with the depiction of African dancers in the corner. So in that sense, this map is a good example of a snapshot in time when the apartheid regime was flourishing. They had the time, they had the ability to try to, make lavish maps and, host tourists from foreign countries. But in subsequent decades, the apartheid regime obviously had major economic pitfalls. But the real reason why this map is really interesting to me is because of this one small neighborhood on the eastern side of the western side of Johannesburg called Sophia Town. So this map was published in 1951, but just 2 years later, Sophia Town was completely changed. The reason for that being that Sophia Town was one of the few areas in all of South Africa that actually allowed non-white residents to hold property. And as a result of that, Sophia Town became a bastion for cultural, economic activity, and crucially, Black empowerment. However, just 2 years after this, with the Native Resettlement Act in 1954, Sophia Town and its 60,000 residents were forcibly evicted, often using very violent means, and it was subsequently renamed Triumph, which is the Afrikaans word for triumph. Finally, we see differing interpretations. For this category, I'm trying to highlight a very broad range, this idea that maps are not necessarily objective tools. They are subjective measures of the author and their interpretations of the world. So this is a really good example of that, because this is essentially a map of Smyrna, which is it's a city that no longer exists because it was burnt down. Actually, it happened to be like a year after this map was published. But it's the modern city that's built over it is Izmir in Turkey. Smyrna was an incredibly important Mediterranean trade port and saw a lot of heterogeneous activity and groups flourishing and living together. The reason why this map is interesting, though, is because it was in German, and we see evidence of German influence all over the map. So to start out with, we see that, there's Armenian quarter, Jewish quarter, Turkish state. There's also a Greek quarter, a Muslim quarter. There's all these quarters that are very well known and depicted on various maps of Smyrna of the time. But one that's curiously absent from every other map is Frankenstadt, which is basically Franconian city, Franconia being a region in Germany. So the reason why this map is interesting is because it's likely evidence of how an author would, kind of have a biased view of increased German influence in the city when it wasn't necessarily institutionalized that way in other maps. So again, not necessarily a bad thing. It's just kind of an evidence of how certain authors or certain groups might want to aggrandize their own position when it comes to territoriality. Ultimately, this exhibition aimed to explore a variety of topics, but I really think that they're all very interlinked. All of these maps, pretty much every single one I chose is actually in the exhibition, it's in a different category. And that was on purpose to kind of show that these categories all kind of converge on one. And it's not the case that there's just one interpretation or one mechanism in which group may respond to scarcity of space, but rather a combination. And I think that kind of highlights the broad strokes that I was trying to paint earlier about how these maps are not necessarily repetition of history, but rather a repetition of human behavior. All of these maps have very individual stories. They have very unique stories, but the situations that arose to cause them to have similar broad themes are because of very similar innate human characteristics and human dynamics that cause them to have similar characteristics. So this map, as you can see, this map kind of depicts the geographical location of the various maps in the exhibit. It includes around 25 of them, and I'm really excited about how it turned out. This process has been super, super interesting for me. I've learned so much. I really highly encourage other students to do the same. And I would like to thank the DRMC again. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been wonderful. And also, if there are other opportunities, I'm looking to expand my knowledge and interest in cartography. So if you know of any, I'd love to find out about those. Thank you so much.
We've got time for some questions. Ken?
I have a special interest in the Opium Wars. So I'm curious to know how, and I know looking at that area, I know how, the connection. How did you know, just looking at the different quadrants of country quadrants, that it was related to the Opium Wars? Because I didn't see it on the map.
Yeah. Well, my first thought was, why is Austria-Hungary one street away from Japan, and why is Japan across the river from France? So I was like, okay, what's going on here? Then I did some research. I realized that it was, the concessions and the extraterritoriality agreements. And then that relates obviously to the decline of the Qing dynasty, which directly relates to the Opium Wars, because it was because of the Opium Wars that they lost essentially to European powers and then had to cede territory.
Other questions?
To say, I think the Chinese map, it's probably published because of the Boxer Rebellion, like 1900, 1901. Tianjin was a prominent place in it. So you're right about the broad context of the Opium War, but there's also a reason why it was published in, it shows the situation in 1902, 05. And then I wanted to say, Franconian, you're wrong about that. What it means is Frankenstadt refers to the empire of Charlemagne, the empire of the Franks, which kind of is here meant to say it's a medieval city, the pre-Turkish city. So it's close to the coast. So it's a shorthand. Charlemagne is kind of Western Christendom. And so this is a term that, refers to basically, it's the old part of the city. That's what that means.
Yeah, I looked into that actually because I was aware of like Frankenstadt and the Franks essentially. Regardless, I think, well, first of all, I thank you for updating that information. I really appreciate it. But also there was a really long history of Franconian, specifically merchants that were in Smyrna, and they did have a lot of influence in the region. And there were other maps that I saw that kind of seemed to highlight their influence in the city as well.
All right. Thank you very much, Arjun.
You.